In 1542, Pope Paul III took the decisive step of calling a General Council of Christendom to address the deep divisions caused by the Protestant Reformation. This assembly, later known as the Council of Trent after the city of Trent on the Italian-German border, became the central forum for the Catholic Church's response to the crisis. Although the council was announced in 1542, it did not formally open until March 1545, and over the course of nearly 20 years, from 1545 to 1563, it met in 3 major sessions to debate, define, and reform Catholic doctrine and practice. 2 major struggles shaped the council's work. One of the central conflicts surrounding the Council of Trent was the tension between political and doctrinal priorities. Pope Paul III called the council with the primary goal of clearly defining and reaffirming Catholic doctrine in response to Protestant criticisms seeking to eliminate ambiguity and strengthen the Church's position. In contrast, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V had a different concern. He ruled over territories deeply divided between Catholics and Protestants and feared that firm doctrinal rulings would make reconciliation impossible and permanently fracture Christendom. For this reason, Charles pushed for the council to focus more on practical reforms within the Church rather than on sharply defining doctrine, hoping that compromise might preserve unity. Despite his efforts, he ultimately failed, as the council proceeded to make clear doctrinal statements that solidified the divide between Catholicism and Protestantism. Within the Catholic Church itself, a second struggle unfolded during the Council of Trent, revealing deep divisions over how to respond to the Protestant challenge. Moderates within the Church hoped to find a path toward reconciliation, believing that some degree of doctrinal flexibility might heal the growing rift and restore Christian unity. In contrast, conservatives firmly rejected any compromise, viewing concessions to Protestant ideas as dangerous and heretical. They insisted on a strong reaffirmation of traditional Catholic teachings and practices. Ultimately, the conservatives gained the upper hand, supported by later popes, particularly Paul IV, who opposed any form of accommodation with Protestantism. Although Protestants were technically invited to attend the council, they were not permitted to participate in debates or vote on decisions. Recognizing that their role would be purely symbolic, they dismissed the invitation as meaningless and refused to take part. The Council of Trent produced one of the most important doctrinal affirmations in the history of the Catholic Church, firmly rejecting Protestant teachings while reasserting traditional Catholic doctrine. Through its decrees, the Council clarified Catholic beliefs with precision and authority, leaving little room for ambiguity or compromise. In doing so, it not only strengthened the internal unity of the Church, but also drew clear and lasting boundaries between Catholicism and the growing Protestant movements. The Council made several important decisions as a result. The Council addressed the question of religious authority by clearly defining the relationship between Scripture and tradition. It declared that both the Bible and Church tradition were equally authoritative in matters of faith, rejecting the Protestant claim that Scripture alone should serve as the sole guide. Furthermore, the Council asserted that only the Roman Catholic Church, acting through its bishops and clergy, had the legitimate authority to interpret Scripture, thereby preventing individual or conflicting interpretations. To reinforce this unity, the Council affirmed the Latin Vulgate, translated by St. Jerome, as the official biblical text of the Church. Through these decisions, the Council directly opposed the Protestant principle of sola scriptura and reinforced the central authority of the Catholic Church in determining religious truth. The Council made a decisive statement on the question of salvation, reaffirming that it is achieved through a combination of faith and good works. In doing so, it directly rejected the Protestant doctrine of justification by faith alone, emphasizing instead that belief must be accompanied by action and a life of obedience to God. The Council of Trent firmly upheld the central teachings of the Catholic Church, reinforcing its traditional understanding of the sacraments and the Eucharist. It affirmed the importance of all 7 Catholic sacraments as essential channels of God's grace, directly rejecting Protestant efforts to reduce their number. The Council also strongly defended the doctrine of transubstantiation, maintaining that the bread and wine of the Eucharist truly become the body and blood of Christ. In addition, it confirmed the validity of the Mass as a true sacrifice, not merely a symbolic act of remembrance, and upheld the doctrine of concomitance, which teaches that Christ is fully present in both the bread and the wine. Through these declarations, the Council drew clear boundaries between Catholic and Protestant beliefs, and denying transubstantiation remained a serious offence within the Church. The Council of Trent also addressed several practices and beliefs that had become central points of controversy during the Reformation. It reaffirmed the existence of purgatory, maintaining that souls could undergo purification before entering heaven. The Council also upheld the spiritual validity of indulgences, recognizing them as a legitimate aspect of Catholic teaching. At the same time, however, it acknowledged past abuses and took steps to correct them by forbidding the sale of indulgences, one of the primary practices that had drawn criticism from Martin Luther. In this way, the Council both defended traditional beliefs and attempted to reform the corrupt practices that had fueled the Protestant challenge. The Council of Trent also took decisive steps to address long-standing abuses within the clergy, recognizing that reforming church leadership was essential to restoring credibility and discipline. It required clergy to reside in their own dioceses, ensuring that bishops and priests actively oversaw their communities rather than neglecting their responsibilities. The Council also prohibited pluralism, the practice of holding multiple church offices at once, which had often led to corruption and absentee leadership. To further strengthen the Church, it emphasized the need for better educated priests who could properly instruct the faithful. Most importantly, the Council established seminaries in every diocese, creating a formal system for training clergy. These institutions ensured that future priests would be both theologically knowledgeable and morally disciplined, marking one of the most significant and lasting reforms of the Catholic Reformation. The Council of Trent did more than clarify Catholic doctrine. It played a decisive role in shaping a clear and unified Catholic identity in the face of Protestant challenges. Central to this effort was its affirmation of the Church's authority and structure. The Council declared that the Church was a visible institution established by Christ through St. Peter, reinforcing the idea of apostolic succession and the central role of the papacy. In doing so, it strengthened Roman primacy and significantly expanded papal authority. Ironically, a council that some had hoped would limit papal power instead reinforced it. This shift was not without controversy, as certain Catholic monarchs, including Philip II of Spain, initially resisted publishing the Council's decrees because they enhanced the authority of the Pope at the expense of royal control over national churches. In response to the Protestant rejection of many traditional practices, Catholic leaders placed a deliberate emphasis on the visible and sensory experience of worship. They promoted the use of stained glass windows and religious art to teach and inspire the faithful, while incense filled church spaces to create a sense of reverence and sacred atmosphere. Sacred music played an essential role in enriching the liturgy, and clergy wore elaborate vestments that reflected the dignity and continuity of the Church. Through these elements, the Catholic Church sought to engage the senses, reinforce its traditions, and create a powerful, immersive form of worship that distinguished it clearly from the simpler practices of many Protestant communities. These reinforced the mystery, beauty, and transcendence of Catholic worship, directly contrasting Protestant churches which stripped away decorations to focus on Scripture and the spoken word. As the Catholic Church clarified its teachings and practices, both Catholics and Protestants sought to make their differences unmistakably clear. Catholics often looked upon the plain, unadorned interiors of Protestant churches as lacking spiritual depth and richness, seeing them as stripped of the sacred beauty that inspired devotion. Protestants, in turn, viewed the elaborate decorations of Catholic churches, the art, ornamentation, and ceremony, as worldly excesses that distracted from true faith. This growing contrast in worship and belief sharpened mutual suspicion and reinforced division, deepening the religious polarization that the Council of Trent had formally established. In the aftermath of the Council of Trent, the Roman Catholic Church emerged with a clearly defined and unified system of doctrine that left little room for ambiguity or internal debate. No longer the single universal church of Western Europe, it now stood as one Christian denomination among many, consciously distinguished from Protestant traditions. The reforms and definitions established at Trent provided a stable foundation that shaped Catholic belief and practice for centuries. In fact, this doctrinal framework remained largely unchanged for over 400 years, until the reforms of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s introduced a new phase of adaptation and renewal. The Council of Trent effectively marked the end of attempts at reunifying Western Christendom. Catholic and Protestant identities were now firmly established and would remain sharply divided for centuries.